Everybody, I'm up here talking to you from Fort Kent, Maine. What you see over there is called the blockhouse. That blockhouse was built to actually defend this part of Maine from something called the Aroostook War, which really has kind of weird beginnings in the 1820s. As settlement grew up here, it became very clear that nobody could really tell you where the border was. And this is because, when the Revolutionary War ended in 1786, part of the settlement, they drew a red line across where they thought Maine and Canada would kind of separate. But since there wasn't any real maps and nobody really knew what it looked like, it was kind of up for grabs to what this border should look like. In any event, the bottom line is, by the 1820s, you've got a lot of settlement taking place up here, mostly for the timber industry. And they were coming from both sides. Americans were coming from down south up here to far northern Maine, and the Canadians were coming in from the Atlantic, and they both had their eyes set on one thing, and that was a bunch of timber. Timber was a huge industry up here. In any event, as settlement continues to grow, land claims continue to grow, and then Maine got its statehood, and as soon as Maine became its own state, they had land agents that would start to sell land and tracts of land and timberland up here. They had no idea whose side of the border the land belonged to, and Canadians were doing the same thing. And so it wasn't very long before there started to be some problems. And people had disputed claims, and they would often show up with gangs of people to protect their rights and protect their land. And before you know it, you had militias, the armed, civilian groups of armies starting to, get on both sides of the border. And by the late 1820s, somebody had the gall to go raise an American flag on what many Canadians thought was their side of the border, and that sparked a real confrontation. And the next 10 years, there were raids, counter raids. There were gatherings of militia on both sides. At one time, there was almost 2,000 militiamen camped on both sides of the river, Canadian and American alike. Thankfully, nobody actually fired a gun, but they built structures like this to help defend what they considered to be their territory. And of course, New Brunswick is right over there, right across the river, which you can't see because the snow is about 100 feet deep. In any event, how did this whole thing end? Well, cooler heads prevailed. Daniel Webster, one of America's great statesmen, sat down with the British representative, Lord Ashburton, and they dug out the old map from the old Treaty of Paris that had been created, and allegedly that red line had been drawn by Benjamin Franklin himself. And they compared that map to a more locally produced map that was a lot more accurate. And through a little horse trading, they were able to finally fix the border mostly along the St. Johns River, that finally settled the border dispute in the early 1840s. So that was that, and that took care of the New Hampshire border as well, because even the New Hampshire border was up for grabs for a lot of that time, and that actually spawned its own little mini war called the Uprising in Indian Stream. But this one treaty pretty much took care of the Canadian border all across New England, right across New York, and into Michigan, and all the way to Minnesota. And so this one treaty kind of took care of everything. Like I said, they call it the Aroostook War, but there really wasn't a war. Nobody actually got shot or killed. However, 38 Americans did die in that period of time, and there's weirdly only one memorial over one of the participants, a guy named Hiram Smith, and there's 7 or 8 accounts as to figuring out how he died up here. Probably most likely either died of misadventure, maybe he drank too much, maybe he drowned, maybe he got run over by a supply wagon, maybe he fell off a cliff. I don't know. But 38 Americans did die, staking their claim up here. Strangely, the British, who love to keep track of everything, they report 2 deaths. They report that 2 British servicemen died by being eaten by bears. So there you go. So those guys didn't make out any worse than Hiram Smith, but it's kind of strange. Anyway, that's the story of the Aroostook War, and thanks to my wife for filming me. I appreciate it. Bye, guys.